Thank you so much for tuning in again this week. And guys, I can't wait to dive in. Man, if you know me, you know that I am a huge Brandon Sanderson fan. And guys, we finally are getting a new book. Can you believe it? The Lost Metal, guys. The Wax and Wane Era 2, Book 4, Surprise Book 4 is finally coming out. We've been waiting so long for this. And it finally is coming out November 15th. It's so close. I actually can't wait. I just finished rereading book number 3, Bands of Mourning, just to get back in the headspace of Wax and Wane. So today, I thought it would be really fun to kind of do like a state of the Cosmere type episode. So we'll do a review or like a summary of the last book so we can refresh everybody so we're all on the same page. You know, we remember all of the big things that happened going into this book 4. But then also, if you have read Bands of Mourning, you know that Era 2 has been a lot more like Cosmere aware than previous Mistborn books. So I just think it's a good idea to kind of go through like the big Cosmere type things that are going on in the other books that may or may not come into play in the Lost Metal. I mean, I'm like one of the only people I feel like out there that has been staying away. Like, I know that they've been releasing chapters for the Lost Metal on the website, on the Tor website, but I like to go into books fresh. Like, I don't want to... The only thing I've read is like a year ago from the newsletter. He as in Brandon Sanderson, he did the prologue. He released the prologue from Wayne's point of view. So that's literally the only thing I've read from this book. So I haven't read any of the chapter previews or anything. So we're just going to go through and we're going to hit each major planet, system, whatever you want to call it, and talk about what's going on there and how it may or may not relate to the Lost Metal going into this book. Because, guys, I just have the feeling that this one is going to be a doozy. I think the Lost Metal is going to be probably the most Cosmere aware book so far. And I think it's going to have a lot of implications for the Cosmere in general. So, yeah, sit back, relax. If you're a Brando Sando fan, buckle up. If you haven't read anything from Brandon Sanderson, I think Mistborn is a really great series to jump in on. But we'll talk more about it. We'll just get into it, okay? So, like I said, so The Lost Metal is the book that's about to come out on November 15th, and it's the 4th and final book in the Mistborn Era 2 series. And so when I say Era 2, I mean... So when Brandon Sanderson years ago, when he did like the blueprint, the timeline, I guess, of his books. So Mistborn was supposed to be a trilogy of trilogies, right? So you have the first trilogy, which is done, fantastic, and then a few years later, the second set of Mistborn trilogies came out, and it's set 300 years after the first one. And like I said, he always said that it was going to be a trilogy of trilogies. So then when Bands of Mourning, the third book, comes out, and then it literally ends on a cliffhanger, you're like, wait a second, this can't be a trilogy. And lo and behold, he surprised us. And the second set of trilogies is actually 4 books. So we've got that. And yeah, so to explain what I mean by the Cosmere, if you aren't Cosmere aware, right? So the Cosmere describes, it's like the overarching shared universe that all of Brandon Sanderson's books set place in. So even though each like series is like self-contained in the fact that like you can read those books by themselves, without being aware of everything else going on, but they are all set in the same like overarching universe. So if you have read Stormlight or even in Mistborn, there's like little hints and little nuggets of things from other planets and other series that'll show up in these books, right? So when I say Cosmere, I really mean like everything. So that's the crazy thing about the Brandon Sanderson fandom, about the books, is because literally, they all can play into each other. So the Cosmere really, it consists of everything that he's written so far, right? So that would be Elantris, which was his very first published book. We've got Mistborn, Heirs 1 and 2. Heir 3 is going to come out eventually. We've got Warbreaker with its eventual sequel. The Stormlight Archive series, which right now there are 4 books out. The 5th book is supposed to come out. It got pushed back. It was supposed to come out next year, but I think it's going to be... It's probably going to end up being spring of 2024 when that book comes out. You've got White Sand, which is a graphic novel, which is really neat. I think that's 3 volumes. And if I'm not mistaken, there's an omnibus that either is out or is about to come out, where it's all 3 of the volumes together. And then you've got smaller worlds and like short stories that are mentioned in the Arcanum Unbounded, which is literally a collection of short stories. Some of them set on worlds that we've already visited, some of them set on worlds that we don't know. But that's literally, the whole book is just like a collection of short stories that are all like Cosmere related, right? So let's just get right into it. Like I said, I want to start with Bands of Mourning and do like a proper revisit. And so we all are caught up to speed. We remember the main things that happened in the very previous book, because if the Lost Metal is anything how the Bands of Mourning was, Bands of Mourning picked up right where the previous book left off. So I'm anticipating that's what the Lost Metal is going to do. And then after we go through Bands of Mourning, we can world hop and talk about what's going on in the different worlds, right? So Bands of Mourning was the last book. The main shard... Okay, let's back up. So Mistborn takes place on a planet called Scadrial, and the main shards was Preservation and Ruin, but now the main shard there is Harmony, which is the combination of Preservation and Ruin. And if you have no idea what I'm talking about, please go back and read Mistborn Era 1. So good. That might be like one of my favorite... Like, don't get me wrong, I love all Brandon Sanderson books, but like... The first time reading Mistborn Era 1 was like, it was a one-of-a-kind experience. Like, it was so good. But anywho, so we've got Harmony. He's our main shard. And the major magic systems, we've got Allomancy, Hemalurgy, and Feruchemy, right? And the neat thing about Scadrial, too, that we have to all remember is Scadrial is the most technologically advanced system that we've seen so far. Out of all the worlds, out of... all the civilizations. I mean, if you remember, they have electricity, they've got trains, they've got guns, so they understand like gunpowder and bullets. And we had a little snippet of they have projectors. Like they have figured out how to like make light projectors, and pretty soon you can just assume that like, you know, that technology is just going to keep moving. It was funny because even in Mistborn Era 1, you could tell that they were more technologically advanced in other places because, like, they had canned food. So, yeah, that I feel like that is an important thing to remember. That Scadrial is, like, they've got the tech, right? So, summary. Bands of Mourning, we follow our main guy, the guy, is Waxilium. Ladrian, yeah. But the whole gang, you've got Wax, you've got his best friend Wayne, his... best friend, partner in crime, well, partner in being a detective, Wayne. You've got Marcy, you've got Melan, the Khandra, and then Steris, who is Wax's fiance, right? And so the book starts with the gang being contacted by another Khandra, and this Khandra explains to them that there is... they had a Khandra that went out like on an expedition, and... he came back, but he came back wounded and he was missing a spike. And so if you remember with Khandra, they each have 2 spikes. And these spikes are what give them sentience, but it's also what connects them to Harmony. So Harmony can like talk to them and like influence them, not in a bad way, but it's what makes their connection to Harmony, right? And so the Khandra comes back and he's missing one of his spikes. And like that's a big deal because Khandra literally can't be Khandra without both of their spikes. And so the whole thing is they need the second spike because this conjurer, he went out on expedition, I guess, to try and find the Bands of Mourning, which is title of the book. And so you learn that the Bands of Mourning are actually they're supposed to be a set of bracers that were created by the Lord Ruler, and these bracers would essentially give you the power of the Lord Ruler. And the lore is that these bands of mourning have been hidden away in some temple up in the mountains, but it's like one of those like I don't know, one of those like urban legend stories that everyone like has heard, but like you don't really know if it's true or not. But the thing is, when this conjurer came back, and he's missing a spike, so he's like not totally there. He's kind of like speaking nonsense, but like he has pictures, he has sketches, he has hard evidence of these bands of mourning actually existing, right? But here's the thing. So when that conjurer comes to Wax and tries to get him to do this job, Wax is like not over his beef with Harmony from what happened in the last book. Because if you remember, in the last book, he had to re-kill his wife because she was actually a planted conjurer that was working on behalf of Harmony. And it was a whole thing. And like, the way that the second book ended, Wax was like broken. Like having to kill his wife a second time like really broke this man. And like he doesn't fuck with God anymore. So like he doesn't want anything to do with Harmony. He's like already pissed that like the Conjurer show up because he knows that the Conjurer are like they work in direct contact with Harmony. Like he doesn't want anything to do with it, right? But the thing is, Wax, he's a detective. And so when he gets presented this mystery of potentially this like item of like grand lore actually existing, and you know, there's an injured conjurer that's like missing a spike, like all of this like mystery really like draws him in. And Wax hates that because he knows that Harmony knows that. Like he knows that God knows what he likes and like what drives him, so he's like kind of pissed that Harmony is like using that to his advantage. But Wax ends up agreeing to this mission or whatever, but not just because it's what Harmony wants. And like, sure, he's interested in the Bands of Mourning and like finding that spike or whatever, but really he has a strong suspicion that his sister who was kidnapped, they might be able to find her by following the trails for these Bands of Mourning, right? And so, yeah, so they agree, Wax and Co., they agree to, where do they have to go? Somewhere. Oh, mind you, the conjurer that comes to give them the message from Harmony or whatever, literally comes to interrupt Wax's wedding. Like he's literally about to get married to Steris, but then somehow, some way, there's like a water tower next to the church, and the water tower like falls onto the church, like essentially flooding out the place, and so the wedding gets canceled. So that was a whole thing. But yeah, so the gang, they agree to do this mission for Harmony, and they have an encounter with the Set. And if you remember, the Set is like what would you call it? So they're a secret organization that are on Scadrial, and we don't really know what their overarching goal is. We just know that one, that they like don't fuck with Elendel, which is the capital, and two, they have some interest in allomancy and feruchemy, and we don't really know what they're doing. They have some, we don't know if they're like trying to breed allomancers or if they're trying to like figure out a way to like make proper Mistborns again, but the Set are bad. We don't like them. And coincidentally enough, Wax's uncle, Edwarn, is like one of the higher ups in the Set. So like anytime the Set shows up, Wax is there, Wax is mad. But yeah, so I know I'm going to skip a bunch because I just want to get to like the really important stuff, but there's like a party that happened. They have to go, the gang ends up going to another city called New Saren, and there is like where they're following leads to try and figure out like what could the Set be doing, where could the Bands of Mourning actually be, and they end up hearing about this warehouse, this like giant like yeah, I guess it would be a warehouse where it's like just kind of walls. There's no ceiling. And they end up breaking into this warehouse, and they end up in the warehouse is being controlled by the Set. But there's also this like massive ship, but it's like a ship they've never seen before. Like it doesn't have like oars or sails. So they're like, how does this ship work, right? And then so you got the gang, they kind of split up, and so Wax and who does he go with? Wax goes with Wayne, and they're trying to investigate the ship. And then you've got Marcy and Melan, they're out there looking for the spike, right? So they do end up finding the spike. They find a safe in some office that has the spike, but then also these like strange medallions that they've never seen. And the interesting thing about these medallions is they have, they're made of either 2 or 3 metals, and it's something they've never seen before. And the other weird thing that happens is, when they find the spike, they also find like a room full of cages. And so they think that they might be housing some type of monsters, but turns out there's actually a man in one of these cages. And Marcy breaks him out. I mean, it's only right. You can't just like leave a man in a cage, right? So Marcy breaks him out. And the reason why they thought he was a monster was because he is wearing like a wooden mask where like you can't see his face, right? And so you end up learning that the man's name is Alik. It's one of those things where I don't listen to audiobooks, so like I don't really know how things are pronounced. But yeah, so the guy, his name is, I'm just going to call him Alec for the rest of the time, okay? So Alec, they rescue him, and he ends up helping them sneak onto the ship. And while that's going on, Wax and Wayne, they start a whole commotion. They end up starting this whole big old firefight with the Set. And, you know, they're blapping around. And then Wax ends up finding his sister, gets her out, and then they all are huddled up on this ship, and they're like, well, you know, we're essentially sitting ducks now on this ship. But then Alec, he's like going around, and he's like fiddling with stuff, and like opens a box and opens a thing, and then turns out that the ship, there's a ship in the ship. There's like a glider in the ship. And so Alec, it turns out that he was part of the crew that was manning the ship, and so he gets the glider out, and then they end up escaping on this glider, right? And so you're just like, what? Like, we got flying ships, we got a man in a mask that like they can't communicate with. Oh, I forgot to say that. They couldn't even talk to the guy because he's like speaking another language and they can't understand what he's saying. But then when they get on the ship, homeboy Alec, he gets a medallion. He like switches out his medallion, and so like the medallion has like it's got like strings on it, right? And so they like attach it to their arm, and it turns out that it was like he switched it to would it be an interpreter one or like a communication one, to where he's able to understand the language, right? And so like then he's able to actually speak with Marcy and with Wax and explains like, hey, I'm trying to get us the fuck out of here, right? And so they leave the warehouse, they escape from the Set, and then they all collectively decide that they need to go pursue this temple where the Bands of Mourning are rumored or thought to be held, because they know that the Set knows where it is, and they don't want the Set. Of course, you don't want the bad guys to be able to literally get the power of God, right? So as a group, they decide to head toward this temple. The Sovereign's Temple is what it's called, where the Bands of Mourning are supposed to be. And along the way, you end up learning a lot about Alec. And this is like, of course, it's like the book was already interesting, but like this is where it really starts to open up, right? So Alec is from Southern Scadrial. And so if you remember, in Mistborn Era 1, everybody kind of lived toward the north. But if you remember, it was a whole thing with the Lord Ruler and how he like knocked the planet out of orbit. So like the sun was too hot. So that's why there was the ash mounds, was to, you know, block the ozone. So then the sun wouldn't burn them up. But the crazy thing is, we followed 3 whole books of our main crew in Mistborn, not even thinking about the rest of the planet, right? So like there's literally the rest of the continent. And so Alec, he's from southern Scadrial. And so before like Harmony ascended and like fixed the planet and everything, they were used to a really, really warm climate because they didn't have ash mounts down there, but like as a people they just adapted, right? But then after Harmony ascended and he like fixed the planet and fixed the sun and blah blah blah, it fixed it for our guys, right? Like in the northern part of the country. But then just being unaware, there's a whole nother group of people in southern Scadrial that now, where before they were used to it being really, really warm and having a lot of sun, now it's like the climate is normal, but to them, that's like freezing temperature, right? And so they call that the ice death. Oh, also important to note that these southern Scadrial? Yeah, these southern Scadrians, they were placed there by the Lord Ruler, and they were supposed to be like a control group, because if you also remember, he like genetically modified the Ska to be able to live in these like ashy places. So he kept a group of humans in the southern part of the continent to not experiment on them, to just in case like his plan didn't work. Ended up working, but so yeah. So they're there. The ice death happens, and they're literally, as a people, they are dying. Like they can't survive. Like they're used to it being hot, like not even warm. They're used to it being hot. And so like when the planet gets put back in its right orbit, they literally can't survive. But then one day, some guy shows up, and he gifts the people something called an excisor. And it's a device that can be used to create these medallions that we see Alec carrying. And these medallions that they made grant the power of ferochemical heat. And so I'm not going to go through each metal because that would be like a whole thing. But each metal has a corresponding thing that it does elementically, but then also ferochemically. And so whatever metal it is that stores heat, they're able to use these excisors, which we've never heard about before, but they're able to use these things to then make these medallions that can store heat. And so as a people, they are able to have these medallions touch their skin, and it gives them heat, so then they're able to survive, right? And so the man is literally, to these people, he's literally God. Like he literally gifts them the gift of heat so they can live, right? And so they name him the Sovereign, and they kind of worship him almost like God, right? And he's there, and he helps the people for like a good minute. They're able to make different medallions that do different things, and he's able to distribute these fire medallions around, so then as a people they're able to survive in this cold land. And so all that happens, and then the Sovereign, he had the Bands of Mourning, but either he didn't want them or he didn't want them to get into the wrong hands. So what he does is, the Sovereign, he and some of his priests, I guess, they go up into the mountains and they build this temple, and he is supposedly to have hidden these Bands of Mourning at the temple. And so Alec describes it as, sure, it's like, like an urban legend type thing, but it's also, he thinks, or his people think, that it was like a test left by the Sovereign of, can you actually make it to the temple and find these Bands of Mourning? But then the second part of the test is like, should you even use these bands? Because it's literally, like I said, literally they're said to hold the power of the Lord Ruler, which, if you remember, he was literally God, right? And so so you learn all this from Alec. So the people, so Wax and Wayne and co, they end up learning about a whole new group of people that they didn't know existed. The Sovereign, some guy that is able to create medallions that can just grant you ferochemical powers. And so it's like, once you meet Alec, it's like the world really opens up, right? And so so they end up making it to the temple. And there's like a big old statue of, they think it's the Lord Ruler outside, and he's like holding a spear. And they note that there's like a weird spearhead, but whatever, they don't think nothing of it. And so they're like, okay, well, we need to get through the temple so we can find the bands before the set gets here, because like as they're flying by, they see like a bunch of lights and a bunch of people walking up, climbing up the mountain. So they know that the set is en route. So they're like, guys, we are like, it's time crunch. Like we need to find these bands, right? So thankfully they have a conjurer with them, and they're pretty much immortal. So Wax gets Meilon to go first and like set off all the traps so they can like get down this hallway or whatever. They make it to the end, get to a door they can't open. Go figure. And so then at this point they're kind of stuck, right? But then by the time they come back, they realize that the set has met them there, and Edwarn, whose name is they also call him Suit or Mr. Suit, but Edwarn, he's there and he wants to strike up a deal with Wax. He was like, Wax, I'm the only one that knows how to open that door, and I'm not gonna let you leave. You're not gonna let me leave. So like we got to work together to get these bands. And Wax, like, he knows it's a trap, bro. Like, of course, the set, Edwarn, they're never going to try to, like, do good. Like, why would they try to do good? But, like, it's his only option, right? So he ends up agreeing to work with Edwarn. And they are able to get the door open. And then they end up getting into, like, this... it opens up into this room that has, like, a pedestal. Perfectly placed pedestal in the middle with... it's got like a plush pillow, but then there's nothing there on the pedestal. And then there's like smashed glass everywhere. And they're like, man, did somebody really make it in here already? Like, how did somebody make it in here before we did? When that door was like locked. It was like alamantically locked. And the only other guy that they know of that made it to this temple, that OG Khandra, he came back bopped. Like, who made it in here? But then, yeah, so there's no bands. Everyone's really heard about it. Edwarn, Suit from the set, he's really heard about it. But then, as they're all standing there confused and sad that there's no bands, Wax is like thinking, he's a detective, right? So he's like trying to put all the pieces together. He was like, why would Edwarn, like, sure, Edwarn needed me to open this door, but like, why would he agree to help me? Like, he doesn't care about anything. Like, he's just out here trying to do what the set is trying to do, right? But then he realizes, too late, mind you, he realizes that Edwarn wouldn't have allowed himself to get trapped in a room with Wax unless he had a failsafe. And that failsafe ends up being Wax's sister. Yeah, she was kidnapped. She was kidnapped from by Edwarn like years and years ago, but then turns out that she is also part of the set. So as soon as Wax like realizes this, it's like too late, and Telson ends up fatally shooting him. And so that was like a big reveal. It's like Wax did all this work, spent all this time trying to find his sister, and then she's a mole and shoots him for death. Like, hello? And so, so he gets shot, and he's dying, and, I'm trying to remember, how did they end up, there's, like, another room that they end up, yeah, okay, so in that room, it was, like, there was pits, like, one of the traps that they kept running into were, like, death pits, right? So, after Wax gets shot, he kind of, like, rolls into a pit, and then they end up in another room, and in that room, there's, like, another set of bracers, right? They end up finding a bunch of like seats that are circled around this pedestal, and there's like a bunch of frozen dudes. So you assume that those were the priests that came there with the sovereign originally to put the bands to set them away. But then Edwarn follows Wax in there and picks up the bands, but then turns out they're not the Bands of Mourning. They don't actually work. And so Edwarn was like, man, we spent all this time, all this effort trying to find these bands, and they're not even here. Fuck that. And so he ends up leaving Wax for dead. And Wax actually dies, like, for real dies. And at this point in the book, I'm like, how is our main guy gonna die, bro? Like, hello? And so Wax dies, and after he dies, he actually gets to speak with Harmony, which is, like, such a treat. Because, as we know, Harmony is Sazed from the first series, and we haven't got to, like, actually speak with him ever since he, like, properly ascended and became Harmony. Like, of course we know he's Harmony and he's like doing God things, but like we haven't got to like talk to him like we did in Era 1, right? And so Wax actually gets to talk to Harmony and was like, bro, like, why'd you make me kill my wife? Like, that was so fucked up. But Harmony was like, he pretty much was just like, you know, you were the only one that could kill her. Like, are you really gonna tell me that like you would have been okay if somebody else killed her? And Wax was like, no. And Harmony was like, you know, and I'm sorry that like I haven't really been able to like intervene in your life, but like I got bigger shit going on. And Wax is like, what are you talking about? And then they turn and look, and there's like this ominous big red haze that's just like hanging over the world. And Wax is like, what is that? And Harmony was like, I actually don't know what that is. And as a reader, when you see that, when you have something that even God doesn't know what it is, that's when you get scared. You're like, oh, we're in trouble. We're in trouble. And so, yeah, Harmony was like, I'm sorry if I've been a little distracted. I'm trying to stop this ominous red haze from just like killing the world. So, you know, my apologies. But then he gives Wax the option to either die for real, you know, go off into the ether or whatever, or he can return. And so while all that's happening, while Wax is dead and he's talking to God, you know, the set have at this point, because the set was there at the temple with the gang. So at this point they've taken hostage, I guess you would say, Marasi and Steris and Alec, and Wayne ended up slipping away because he's a slippery guy. But while they get frisked and they're like tied up or whatever by the set, and the set is still like in disbelief that the Bands of Mourning actually weren't there. They're like, you know, are you telling me for real that like, you know, none of the gang has it? And while all this is going, the set, you know, they're doing set things, and Marasi, she's trying to figure out where are the bands? Like, the bands have to be here. Like, we went in that first room, they weren't there. The second set, the set of bracers we found, those were fake. Like, there's no way that the Sovereign would literally make this whole temple for nothing. Like, there's just no way, right? But then she remembers that weird-ass spearhead that they saw when they first came in that was on the statue. The spearhead, it was metal, but if you remember, Wax couldn't push on it. And the main thing to remember about that is the only metals that an allomancer can't push on are either things that are aluminum, that are allomantically inert, or they're a ferochemical like reserve. Like if it is invested ferochemically, it's really hard to detect and to like push it allomantically. And so she's thinking about the spearhead, and she's like, it couldn't have been aluminum because we know what aluminum looks like. So like, could that be the Bands of Mourning? And so then she realizes that that spearhead actually is the Bands of Mourning. Of course, the Sovereign is not just going to leave a couple bracers around for anybody to just break in and take them, right? So like, he reforged them to look like a spearhead, and it's literally like, what do they say? Like, the best hid thing is what's in plain sight or whatever. So that's what he did. He reforged it into the spearhead that's on the statue that's right outside the building. And so she's able to get the spearhead, and for a moment, Marasi actually gets to ascend. And this was so fun because it had so many parallels to Vin ascending for that first time, because then, so she ascends and she like, you know, she's able to fly, and she's able to she's moving so fast that like she's like a blur. Like, she's moving infinitely faster than even Wayne even could in one of his speed bubbles. And she gets vials of metal from off of the set. She's able to take, they don't even know that they're gone. She's able to take the metal vials and down them, and then she just sets off for Wax. She was like, I gotta save this guy, right? And so she busts in the temple, and she finds Wax's body and puts the Bands of Mourning in his hand. And then that's at the same time when Harmony is giving him the option to either die or to go back. And he can hear Marasi calling for him, and he was like, I gotta go back. And as he makes that decision, Harmony was like, but do you have to? And Wax was like, yeah, I have to. It's my duty. And Harmony says, Says it is so good, bro. I know he's Harmony, but like, that still says it, right? He's so good because he was like, well, if it's your duty, if it's what you have to, then can you stop hating the duty that is you? You know what I mean? And that really gives Wax pause, because he was like, all these years, you know, I've always taken pride in being a lawman and doing what's right and doing the best I can. And like, he always felt compelled, like he had to do that. And Harmony was pretty much just like, you got to stop hating yourself for being that way. You know what I mean? Like, yeah, you are a duty bound man, but like, that doesn't have to be a bad thing. And with that, Wax comes back, and then Wax gets to ascend. And you want to talk about someone fucking shit up? Oh my gosh, bro. When Wax gets the bands, you're just like, it's over for the set, bro. Like, it's done. So he busts out the temple, and they're trying to fly away on their ship, and he like brings the ship down, and he's flinging guys. Like, it was so reminiscent of Arrow 1. Like, it was so fun, because there are no Mistborn anymore, you know what I mean? So like, getting to see Wax like be a Mistborn was like such a treat. And he's like got his Mistborn coat on, and oh my gosh, so fun. And so he's able to stop the set. Like I said, he grounds their ship and is able to like help rescue the rest of Alec's crew. Because like I said before, it couldn't have just been him manning this whole big old ship that, you know, takes up a warehouse. It was like a whole crew that was there. And so he arrests Edwarn, and the sister, Telsin, she ends up getting away, which is a bummer. But they end up retrieving the spike that they originally came for. I'm trying to remember everything that happened. Yeah, so they arrest Edwarn, Telsin gets away, but they recover the spike. Oh, and then they don't make friends with the Southern Scadrians, but they come to an agreement to where they're going to open trades. They're going to open trade with the Southern Scadrians. So then they'll be able to come to Elendel and, you know, survive. And then they will get access to the technology that the Southern Scadrians have. And what else? And then the Bands of Mourning. The Southern Scadrians, they felt like they had the right to the bands because it was their ship that ended up finding, and that's why they came up there, was to find the bands. But Wax was like, there's no way we can just like let a regular guy have the power of God. So they end up agreeing to let the Khandra take the Bands of Mourning so it can go back to like their homeland or whatever, since they're like, you know, the oldest beings, and they're the ones that are like the most impartial to life. So yeah, so the Khandra end up taking the bands. The gang, they get the spike back for what was his name? Relure, I think, was that Khandra. And then yeah, they open up trade with the Southern Scandrians. And so that's like the end. And then of course there's the epilogue, which always like, you know, tries to draw you in for the next book. And so in the epilogue, it goes to Edwarn, and he's like been in jail for a couple weeks now, and he's sitting there, he's like, la-di-da, I'm in jail, whatever. And then he gets approached by some being, some kind of thing that has these like glowing red eyes, and the being is pretty much just like, you know, thank you for all your hard work. You know, ever since Wax and them found the bands, we realized that we've got to move up our timeline. And you're, as the reader, you're like, timeline? Like, who are you? And what timeline are you talking about? And Edwarn was like, yeah, that's what I've been trying to tell y'all. We need to move up the timeline. Like, we got to get things moving. But then he was just like, well, you know, we decided that, like, we actually don't need your help anymore. But, like, thanks for your service. And then he just, like, pulls a thing out of his pocket and then detonates it. And then you're like, is that a bomb? And then I guess it was a bomb because the whole place explodes, right? And so then Wax, he wakes up, he startles out of his sleep, and he either heard or felt the bomb somehow. And I forgot. Yeah, Wax and Steris, they end up getting married at the end, and it was really cute and touching. And so they're like on their honeymoon, right? So like he jumps awake in the middle of the night, and Steris is asleep, all cute next to him, and he gets up, and he was like, "What was that? Was that a bomb? Did I like hear something?" And he goes to pick up a coin that he had that, and I know I skipped it earlier, but earlier when they were in New Saren, him and Steris went to some party, and while they were waiting to get in, some beggar guy came up to them and was just like, change for the poor. And so Wax like gives him some money, and then the guy throws a coin at him. He wasn't a coin shot or anything, but throws some weird coin at him, and so Wax kind of like forgets it. It's in his pocket. He forgets about it. You literally don't revisit it for the whole book, right? And then at the end, after Wax wakes up and he like hears this bomb go off or whatever, he, feels compelled, I guess, to like revisit this coin. And then turns out that the coin is actually one of those medallions that we learn about from Alec. And it has like different metals in it. And so he picks it up and he's looking at it, and he realizes that it's a copper mine. And if you remember, copper mines, they store memories. And so he taps it or whatever, and then he ends up looking at the memories of whoever held the coin before, and turns out that who had the coin before was actually the Sovereign. And so it was really neat, because when he's like reliving the memories that are in this copper mine, the Sovereign had one eye that was spiked, so he's looking out regular out of one eye, and then out of the other eye it's just allomantic blue lines. And yeah, so that was like a whole thing. He and I'm trying to remember, because there was like a really poignant line at the end. Oh, it was when the Sovereign finds the Southern Scadrians. He like rolls up on them and like sees them dying or whatever, and then he goes up to one guy and puts his hand on his shoulder and just says like the trademark line of "survive." And guys, when you read that part, I know everybody went crazy, because it describes it as he puts his hand out to put it on Homeboy's shoulder, and the arm is crisscrossed with scars, and then he says "survive." And if you remember anything about Era 1, that was Kelsier. Are you telling me Kelsier was the Sovereign? Like, I thought he was dead. Oh my gosh, guys. This is when it starts to get really deep in like when I said it's really a Cosmere book, because okay, there's just so many things we gotta process. Okay, so if the Sovereign is Kelsier, I thought Kelsier died. We saw him get stabbed, right? But then if you remember, at this point I've read everything, all of the short stories in Arcanum Unbounded, and everything, right? And so there's 2 Mistborn related stories. There's, what are they called? There's the Secret History, and then there's the prequel one, the one that is Kelsier, like when he's younger with his master. But what is it called? There's the one short story that is that takes place in between Era 1 and Era 2. And what is it called? Is it the 11th Metal? Because one of them is called the 11th Metal, and then the other one is called Telling the Story of Kelsier from the Time of His Death. Yes. Okay, yes. So it's the Secret History. It takes place in between Eras 1 and Era 2, and it follows Kelsier after he dies. And then you end up learning that, like, yeah, he's dead, but he's, like, not really dead, but he is... Because of his investiture, he is stuck on Scadrial. And you end up learning that he's trying to figure out a way to get off of Scadrial. Like, if that makes sense. Like, he wants to be a world hopper. Like, he wants to be the one that has all the different types of investiture. But when you learn that he's the Sovereign, you're just like, but why? Like, and it's so funny because it's like a lot of people think that the Sovereign was the Lord Ruler, but like we as the reader know 1000% that the Lord Ruler is dead. Like we saw him die. And just nobody would even think that it could be Kelsier. So you're just like, what is he doing? Right. And so guys, we're gonna get into like super spoilers for everything, like everything. So if you haven't read like everything, I would say skip ahead. I'll put the timestamp. Skip ahead. But I feel like it's really important. There are some important things that we got to talk about going into the Lost Metal. Important things to remember about Era 2 and how they relate to everything else, right? So, number 1, we'll go back to Kelsier. Kelsier is the Sovereign, and he's the leader of the Ghostbloods. What's his name? Thaddeukar. And so you're like, okay, but like, how can he be the leader of the Ghostbloods when the Ghostbloods are on Roshar? But then you end up learning that the Ghostbloods, they have world hoppers almost on every continent or in every system at this point. And we don't really know what the Ghostbloods are trying to do. It's kind of like a similar situation to the set where we don't really know what they're trying to do, but they're interested in investiture and like moving investiture from system to system. And so you can just assume that Thaddeukar / the Sovereign / Kelsier, he's trying to figure out a way to get off of Scadrial. Because like I said, when he died and came back, he is still bound to Scadrial, but he doesn't want to be. Like, he wants to be able to world hop. And so we don't really know what they're trying to do, right? Another important thing to remember about Era 2 / just like the Lost Metal in general. In the timeline of the Cosmere, we have to all be aware that Era 2 takes place after Stormlight 5. So all the things that we read in Rhythm of War happen before the Lost Metal. And so I don't think that Brando Sando wouldn't do anything like spoilery to like spoil anything that would happen in Stormlight, but like, you just got to remember that like the implications of things that are happening in the Lost Metal are taking place after Stormlight 5. So in terms of like Kelsier, he was probably the Sovereign before he was the leader of the Ghostbloods, but what he's doing now is post Stormlight 5. So if that makes sense. So you just got to be aware that like what he's doing and like what our gang is doing is taking place after Stormlight 5. So I feel like that is important to remember. Also, can we talk about Trell? Because we learned that when Wax was talking to Harmony, that red haze, that ominous red haze that he was metaphorically showing descending onto the world, we learned that that's Trell, but we don't really know who or what Trell is. And so it's interesting because if you go back to Era 1, if you remember, so what says that his whole thing was that he was like remembering and researching like all the different religions in the world, and there are like 2 or 3 instances in Era 1 where Trell is mentioned, but just like as a religion, right? And so and then in Era 2, we know that, like, I don't know if it's all of the set, but at least some of the set, they also worship Trell, and they are working in his name or whatever, trying to do whatever Trell is trying to do. But, like, we as the reader and, like, Wax and Code, we don't really know who or what Trell is. And so I did, like, a good amount of digging for this episode because I feel like Trell, I think, is gonna be, like, the big bad for maybe the Cosmere. Because if you look at like, of course we'll talk about it more in a minute, but if you look at like Stormlight, we all thought that the big bad was going to be Odium, but then we saw how that turned out, and like Odium is not the big bad. So like there's got to be a bigger bad than Odium. And the only other thing that has been mentioned across like systems really has been Trell. And Trell is really interesting because it's an entity that not even Harmony knows what it is, and Harmony is literally God. Like, he is the God for this system. So like, if God doesn't know what it is, what could it be? And so there's a major theory going around, and I think I subscribe to this theory that Trell could be an avatar related to a shard. He can't be a shard because we know all of the shards, and none of them are called Trell. And none of them have, like, the same, like, characteristics as Trell. So the leading theory now is that he is an avatar for a shard, or to a major shard. But then the question then will be, but which shard, right? And so I literally went down the list of, like, what shard could it be? So we know for fact, we know 1000% that it can't be ambition, invention, mercy, valor, or whimsy. Because all of these shards, they're unknown at the time when Trellium, which is like his god metal, first appeared. And so, I mean, that just makes sense. If those are unknown at the time when the metal first appeared, it couldn't be them, right? We also know for a fact that it can't be preservation or ruin, since Harmony, when Sazed ascended and became Harmony and not absorbed, but like got all of the knowledge from both of those shards, and neither of them knew who Trell was, so therefore Harmony doesn't know. Harmony doesn't know who they are, so like it couldn't be one of them, right? We also know that it can't be devotion, dominion, or honor, since all three of those are splintered. That's not really a spoiler or anything for Stormlight, because like from day one, honor was splintered. But yeah, so it can't be devotion, dominion, or honor, because like technically those shards don't exist anymore. Also confirmed from words of Brandon. It's not written in a book yet, but like if you're at all into the Brandon Sanderson fandom, you know that like at conventions and stuff, people ask him questions, and then he's always really careful in how he answers these questions to make sure that if they're canonically correct. And so there's like a whole, I know for sure, like if you go to the Coppermind, is it coppermind.net? Yeah, which is pretty much Wikipedia, but like for the Cosmere, they will transcribe and use words of Brandon as like source material, I guess you would call it. Because he makes it a point of only saying things, like of only letting like the right things slip, but then also making sure that like what he does say is like canonically correct, right? So we also have from a word of Brandon that it can't be, that Trell is not an avatar of endowment. He confirmed that. So the only shards that leaves, because remember, was it 17 of them that came from Ad Nauseam? If that's how you say that? The only shards that it could be, that just leaves autonomy, cultivation, or odium. We're pretty sure that it can't be odium because of, we know what odium's deal is. And I don't know if it could be cultivation. Like, yeah, cultivation, she does some things that, like, as the reader, you don't really know / fuck with. But, like, the whole thing with cultivation is she doesn't seem like she has malintent, if that makes sense. Her whole thing is, like, cultivating growth and change. And some ominous red-hazed being that's, like, trying to destroy the world. Like, that just doesn't seem like it would be cultivation's jam. So that really only leaves autonomy. And I said, I tried to do like research, but like autonomy is one of those that like we don't super know a lot about. So I don't know. I'm sure we'll learn more about Trell. Like I said, I'm pretty sure he's like the big bad. We'll definitely learn more about Trell in this next book, as well as just like the Cosmere books to come. But yeah, that's my leading theory. I think Trell might be an avatar of autonomy. And then just another small thing to keep in mind about Era 2 going into this book is Hoid. So we all know Hoid, our favorite world hopper. He's pretty much present in every single series that we read. But, like I said before, if you remember that Era 2 takes place post Stormlight 5, and if you remember, Hoid, he has a Nahel bond. Like, he has a Spren. And the whole thing about Kelsier being stuck on Scadrial is the fact that his investiture is tied to this system. But Hoid, we see Hoid in Bands of Mourning, which means he figured out a way to move that investiture off planet. And I think that is going to end up being really important because, yeah, we know, like, at this point in all the books that are out, we know that Hoid has most investitures from each system. The only one that we know for a fact that he doesn't have is, like, from Elantris, because the thing with Aeon Door, and I'll talk about it in a minute, but the thing with Aeon Door is that is, like, actually geographically bound to that planet, so that would be, like, the only magic that you wouldn't be able to use somewhere else. But, like, he has a Sprin. We know he's a Mistborn, because we saw in the Secret History, we saw him eat the bead that gives you the Mistborn powers. What else is there? Yeah, those are, like, the main two. But, yeah, so I think that's going to end up being important, knowing that Hoid is on Scadrial post-Stormlight, especially because we know that he has a Sprin. And I think that'll end up being important for Kelsier, trying to figure out how to get off Scadrial. And so, yeah, that's pretty much everything going on Scadrial right now. I'm really interested to see what's going to happen in this next book. I think, like I said at the beginning, I think this one is going to have a lot of implications for the Cosmere in general. And as always, I don't think it's going to end happily. We kind of just got lucky that Era 1 ended in a, like, it kind of tied up in a nice bow, even though there's, like, still stuff going on. But, like, yeah, Vin and Ellen died and Seiza became God. Like, those are pretty... Seiza becoming God and, like, the way that Vin and Ellen died, like, for the cause of humanity, like, those were kind of nice. Like, you know what I mean? I don't know if this one is going to end well. Just because of Trell. Like, just the ever-looming threat of Trell. I don't think it's going to... I don't know. I would say maybe in, like, a month or two, we may sit down and do, like, a proper discussion about the Lost Metal. I think that would be kind of fun. But yeah, so that's the summary of Bands of Mourning and what's going on Scadrial. But like I said, I do think it's important. We're going to just briefly go system by system and talk about the big Cosmere things that are going on each system, because like we've all seen, this Wax and Wane Era 2 is really Cosmere aware. And so I just don't know what all Cosmere things are going to be mentioned or, like, you know, relevant to this book. So let's just brush up on all the Cosmere things that are going on, right? So next on my list is we have the planet of Nalthis, which is where Warbreaker took place. And on Nalthis, their main shard is Endowment, and their main magic system is Breath. And so the important things to remember about Nalthis / Warbreaker is, so we've got Vasher / Zahel and Vivienna / Azure. They're both currently on Roshar, which was a super fun Easter egg if you had read Warbreaker before reading Stormlight, because the way that they both get introduced, you're just like, I feel like I know who you are, right? And that's also another neat, they're a really good example because, so they both are from Nalthis and they're on Roshar, but they're both able to still use Breath. And so, like, that brings in a bunch of implications of, like, you know, is every person everywhere? Are you always born with one breath? You know, why are they able to use Breath on Roshar, even though that's not the magic system there? I think that'll end up being important for Kelsier as well. But yeah, so Vasher and Vivienna, they're both on Roshar, and they're both looking for Nightblood. And if you remember from Warbreaker, the way it ended up was they were together and had Nightblood. So, like, somehow, some way, they're beefing with each other, and they both lost Nightblood. And if you remember, Zeth currently possesses Nightblood, which he calls Sword Nimi, which is really funny. But yeah, and I think Nightblood is going to end up being really important. I don't know. I mean, of course, I doubt in this Era 2, in the Lost Metal, Nightblood will be important. But I think in the Cosmere as a whole, I think Nightblood is, like, really important. Because if you remember, so Nightblood was created by Vasher and his... Were they married? Or were they just lovers? I can't remember. What's her name? Shishara? Shishara. They created Nightblood trying to recreate a shard blade, which tells you that both of them had figured out a way to get off of Nalthis and visited Roshar, were there long enough to see what a shard blade is and what it can do, take that knowledge back to Nalthis and try to create a shard blade. But the whole thing is with and we learned about it more in Bands of Mourning, but just like the whole concept of intent, and what's the other one? Because for investiture to work, it's 3 things. You need the power, you need the intent. What's number 3? Damn it. But anyway, but yeah, so they didn't have all the pieces together correctly to make like a proper shard blade, and then you ended up with this like amalgamation of thing of Nightblood. And the other really neat thing, like, so of course, like, I had to do my research on Nightblood, but the other neat thing about Nightblood is that it was originally made of steel before it was awakened, and then it originally also had an aluminum scabbard. And that's interesting to note because they didn't really ever talk about it in Warbreaker / like on Nalthis, but like the different elements that the different metals have. Like, of course, in Stormlight we learned about it because of Fabrials and stuff, and then of course in Mistborn, because like that's their whole jam is metals, of what the different metals can do. But it's interesting to note that when they made Nightblood originally, that he had a aluminum scabbard, so they had to have known that aluminum was inert, like, for investiture. So that's interesting. And so then so Nightblood was originally created. They tried to recreate a shard blade. He was originally supposed to consume the biochromatic breaths, like their magic system on Nalthis, but then now we know that it can consume like any types of investiture because of what we've seen on Roshar. Like, we've seen whenever Zeth would hold it, and then that moment whenever Lift was touching him while he was holding it, and how it was taking their investiture. And then, you know, the whole thing of how it killed Rays, and that's a whole thing. We'll talk about it in a minute. But so Nightblood can consume any type of investiture, which I think will be really important for the Cosmere as a whole. And also the fact that it's been confirmed from Words of Brandon that Nightblood is one of the most heavily invested non-shard entities in the entire Cosmere. And I feel like that has a lot of weight to it, because as far as we know, like, a shard blade is kind of like the most OP weapon, like, in the Cosmere. Like, a shard blade is the most heavily invested right next to, like, a herald, right? Like, it's, like, up there. And Nightblood, we now know, is up there as well. Like, one of the most heavily invested non-shard entities. Like, that's literally what coppermine.net told me. And so I think that'll end up being really important. And the thing that's interesting too about not just Nightblood, but kind of how I was talking about before, the whole fact that Vasher and Vivenna are on Roshar, so they were able to figure out a way to get off world, which means that there has to be a perpendicularity somewhere on Nalthis for them to get out. And they're both able to use breath on Roshar. So kind of what I was saying before, I think just their existence will be important for what Kelsier is trying to do, because they were able to get off world and still use like their home magic, but on another planet. So I think that'll end up being important. But that's kind of all that's going on Nalthis right now. I'm not going to sit here and, like, you know, summarize each book, because that'll be like a 3-hour video. But I just want to touch on, like, the main things going on in each system, right? So next up, we've got my favorite, a lot of people's favorite, which is Roshar. And so Roshar, that's where Stormlight Archive takes place. There's 4 books out right now. And like I said, book 5, it was supposed to come out next year, but Brandon Sanderson is a crazy person, and he wrote 4 books in secret. So, like, you got the Secret Project books that are going to come out first. And so this one, the timeline got pushed back a little bit. So I think this one is supposed to come out spring of 2024. So we've got a minute. But on Roshar, our main shards are Cultivation. We've got Honor, which is splintered. And then now we've got Odium, which Roshar was not his home planet originally. And their main magic system is Surge Binding. And like I said earlier, the latest book in the series is Rhythm of War, which pretty much should have been a science novel because of all of the implications and things we learned about not hellbonds and fabrials and investiture and yeah, Rhythm of War was a lot. I feel like I need to reread it for like a third time just from like how much was packed in that book. The main, we're just gonna bullet list it off, guys. There's just so much that went on in this book. So we have Navani. She became a bondsmith. So now her and Dalinar, they're both bondsmiths. But she's not just a bondsmith. She bonds to the sibling, which we learn is the Spren that inhabits Yir-Thiru. And that's a whole thing because the sibling is like not a full shard, but is like it's kind of like how the Night Watcher? I always mix it up with what's her name from Skyrim. Not the Night Mother, but the Night Watcher. And how the Stormfather are, how they're like the children of the Spren, but like they're not. It's a whole thing. But yeah, so she bonds with the sibling, which is the Spren that inhabits Yir-Thiru. We've got Kaladin. He swore his fourth ideal. Shallan, she combined / reabsorbed one of her split personalities, which was like a whole thing. We've got Adolin, who he is like making a sort of like reverse not hellbond with his sword Maya / Testament. That's like a whole thing. But then like the biggest thing, like all of those things are big, but like the biggest thing is that like Taravangian, he's Odium now, and you're just like, what? What? Yeah. So like I mentioned before, so Nightblood, I'm trying to remember how did it happen. Zeth thought that he was stabbing Taravangian, but Taravangian was like in a vision with Odium, and when he got stabbed, Taravangian was able to use Nightblood to stab and kill Raze, because Nightblood, like I said, it consumes investiture. And so the whole thing you got to remember about the shards is you have the vessel, like the person holding the shard, but then the shard, because so the shard has its own intent, but that shard has to be held by a vessel, right? And so the vessel of Odium is the shard, but the vessel was Race. And so when Taravangian stabs him with Nightblood, Nightblood is able to consume the investiture of Race, essentially killing him. And then Taravangian is able to ascend and take Odium for himself. And like, that's a whole thing. Like, you want to talk about being scared? Because Taravangian, we know that like this guy is like a mastermind because of his whole his boon and his curse from cultivation. Because remember, whenever he asked cultivation for his like boon, I guess, he said that he wanted the capacity to save humankind. And he thought that by saying that, he thought he was asking for great intelligence. But what cultivation actually did for him was granted him the capacity where he would either be really, really intelligent, like smart enough to solve these problems, but when he's really smart, he has no empathy and like doesn't care about people. But then on the flip side, he'll be really empathetic, but like really dumb. For him, those things were like they were mutually exclusive. Like he couldn't be smart and empathetic at the same time. But now that he has ascended and has taken Odium's power, shard, there we go, taken the shard for himself, he's able to use both sides of them to channel that into being Odium. And I think this is going to be tough because Taravangian is a smart guy. Not even thinking about the diagram or like how he kind of like orchestrated the whole thing that's going on right now. Taravangian as Odium is going to be tough. And yeah, I don't know, man. I still will stand firm by saying that I don't think Trell is Odium. because I don't think Taravangian will have the time/resources to like create a whole another entity in the time in between Stormlight 5 and Mistborn Era 2. But it's not great. I'll tell you that. Him being Odium is not great. We also learned a lot about Fabrials. And we learned that Fabrial just doesn't mean like a thing on Roshar. It's just more so like how metals interact with Spren. So almost like not just machinery, but like I think in theory a Fabrial could be used anywhere, because the whole thing is just using the investiture of a place and how it interacts with metals and like getting it to do the thing that you want. And so yeah, we learned a lot about Fabrials, and it was really neat reading Rhythm of War, because when Navani starts learning about like how different metals interact differently with the Spren, a lot of the reactions she's seeing are the things that we know to be true from how metals react allomantically and ferochemically. So this is like a really, really good example of like how in the Cosmere everything is related, because like, for example, she was doing an experiment with a gem or whatever, and the metal frame for it was zinc. And when the metal frame was zinc, she realized that the captured Spren's effect will manifest more strongly. And we know that to be true because in Mistborn, rioters, that's what they use, is zinc. Rioting to make emotions more strong. And I just thought that was so neat, because now we're seeing like all of our knowledge of metals and stuff from Mistborn carrying over into Stormlight. I just thought that was so neat. And seeing how aluminum again is inert, even on Roshar. Yeah, we learned it's a lot. Another really, really fun nugget in Rhythm of War is we've actually met a Southern Scadrian before. So reading Bands of Mourning, you think that's the first time that you've ever met someone that wears a mask, or seeing somebody wearing a mask, that's like new to us, but we've actually met a Southern Scadrian before. Because if you remember, one of the Ghost Bloods, how do you say her name? Eatil? Remember in, I think it was the second book, when she was rolling with Shallan and they were trying to break into the mental ward so that she could talk with homeboy, what's his name? Talon, one of the heralds. The person that she's rolling with, she wears a mask that she never takes off, and like that was a whole thing, because she's like, how are we supposed to blend in if you're literally wearing a mask, like a wooden mask, right? Turns out she's from Southern Scadrial, and so you're like, how did she get off of Scadrial as well? You know what I mean? And so yeah, I thought that was kind of neat. But yeah, there's a lot going on in Stormlight. Stormlight 5 is going to be a whole thing. I'm low-key glad it got pushed back, because like I need to get ready for it. It's not gonna, you want to talk about something not ending well? I just already am anticipating Stormlight not ending well. Like, we know there's a time skip between the first 5 books and the second 5 books. Like, it's not going to be a good time. It's not going to be a good time. It's not. All right. Next on our list, next planet, next system, we've got Cell, which is where Elantris takes place. And so on Cell, their main shards are Devotion and Dominion, which are both splintered. R.I.P. Their main magic system is Aeon Door. And fun fact, there's a short story called Emperor's Soul, which also takes place in the Cell system, but does not take place, because the thing you got to remember about Elantris, it's the name of the book, but it's also the name of the place. The Emperor's Soul takes place in Cell, but not on Elantris. Like, it's there, but it's not there, if that makes sense. And so the important things you got to remember about Elantris. So yeah, their magic system, they use Aeons. And then they also use, the way that their magic works is they use variously shaped, when I looked it up on coppermine.net, they described it as a logographic, also known as a symbol. You have to physically draw the symbol to make the magic work, right? And the thing is, these symbols, they are directly tied geographically to the place of Arleon, which is like the country, I guess, of where Elantris is. And so the whole thing about Elantris is Elantrians, so people from Elantris who can use the Aeon Door, they would have to experience something called the Sheod, which is where they would physically change. It's like a seemingly random event, but like they would physically change how they look to be able to use this magic. And it's not like the Sheod kind of just like will happen randomly to people, and then once you experience the Sheod and become an Elantrian, then you can use the magic, right? And so the whole thing about Elantris is like the prince that was supposed to be king. Wait, let's back it up. The whole thing about Elantris is 15 years before the book started, there was like a massive earthquake that happened that literally like made a giant chasm down the center of Arleon. And after that earthquake happened, Elantrians were no longer able to use the magic. And then the whole thing is like before the earthquake, when you would become an Elantrian, you would have like beautiful hair and you'd have like silvery skin and like were pretty much immortal, like couldn't feel pain, and like, you know, it was great. It was a great time to be an Elantrian. But then after that earthquake happened and it caused the chasm down the center of Arleon, it like severed the connection to the magic. So like if you were an Elantrian, now you like your hair falls out and you've got like nasty skin and you like go crazy, and it's like looked to be like almost like a curse to experience the Sheod and become like an Elantrian. But then so then the prince of Arleon, like everybody loves this guy. One day he wakes up and he's experienced the Sheod, and so like now he's like gross and like ugly. And so what they would do is like when you would experience the Sheod, so like the capital of Elantris, which is also called Elantris, the capital, they like walled it in and they just like put all the Elantrians in there. Like if you experience the Sheod, like you're just going in there and they just like lock the door and throw away the key, right? So like when the prince experiences the Sheod, it's like a whole thing because he's the prince and everybody loves him, but they throw him in Elantris. And that's like a whole thing. But anyway, he ends up figuring out over the course of the book that the magic is geographically tied to the place. And so the reason why the magic wasn't working is because when they would draw the symbol, they were drawing the old symbol of like how the world used to look. But by including the line or like the chasm that now exists down the middle of Arleon, you're able to access the magic. And so through that, Raoden, he's able to save the day, and people learn how to use the Aeon Door again, and the Sheod isn't a bad thing anymore. Now it's how it was like in olden days, how like you would be like a proper Elantrian of being able to access the Aeon Door and use the magic and use it for good, right? Yeah, so there's Elantris is interesting because so far it's the only one where the magic is like directly tied geographically, not like with Kelsier, how his investiture is bound to that system. That's different because in theory you could use Allomancy anywhere, you could use Feruchemy anywhere just by like being able to use it. But like with Aeon Door, it changed with the geography of the place, which is interesting. A couple important things to remember about Cell, mainly Elantris, is there is a perpendicularity in Elantris. If you remember, whenever like Elantrians would die or they would be ready to die, they would put them into this pool, like it was like a lake pond thing that kind of had like a shimmery surface. We learned that that's a perpendicularity. And another interesting fact is Door. So like the magic. Aeon Door is like the geographical usage of it. Door is just like the overarching term of the magic. Door is not only is it geographically bound to that place, but it's region specific. So the further you travel from Elantris, the weaker the magic becomes. And so I think this is really interesting to think about in relation to like Kelsier, because we haven't seen, like we don't know for a fact if like Allomancy we know that like allomancy doesn't get weaker the farther you are from like Elendil, right? Like obviously he was able to use like allomancy and feruchemy like when he was in southern Scadrial, but that's different than in Elantris because, like I said, the further you get from Elantris, the weaker the magic becomes, which is interesting. Yeah. So then another interesting thing about Elantris are they have what's called Seons. Seons, they're sapient beings. They're thought to be like splinters of devotion, right? So like if you remember, the Shard devotion is splintered, R.I.P. But Seons are kind of like they remind me a lot of Spren because so they can form bonds with humans, and then those but the difference between a Nahel bond and like a bond with a Seon is with a Seon it seems almost like that bond can be passed on like generation to generation, whereas with the Spren it's just with like that one person, right? And Seons, they are confirmed. We've seen a Seon not on Elantris. We've seen one in Roshar. If you remember, when Shallan, there's a scene in, I think it's in the last book. Yeah, it was in Rhythm of War. Shallan was speaking. She was talking to Mraize through like a box, right? She like had a box that like glowed, and in that box was a Seon, and she was able to use that Seon to like communicate with Mraize. So like that's a whole thing. Because we don't know. In theory, you would think that Spren can't leave Roshar, but a Seon can leave Elantris. So like that's kind of interesting. But and then I'm not gonna go into the short stories. If you're interested in them, they're all in the Arcanum Unbounded. But I'm just gonna hit on like the main planets. And so the last one on the list that would be Taldain, which is the place where the White Sand graphic novels take place. The main shard there is autonomy. And important things to note about Taldain, the scholar Chris, who you've probably heard that name like around before. So Chris, she's the author of the Ars Arcana, which is always the appendix at the end of each book. No matter which book you're reading, there's always an appendix that like explains the magic system, breaks down the things one by one. All of those are written by Chris. Chris is also the narrating voice for the Arcanum Unbounded. And if you remember, so the Arcanum Unbounded is supposed to be like lore-wise, it's supposed to be like a collection of stories and things that Chris has learned throughout her travels, just all put together in one book. And so like each the book, the Arcanum Unbounded, it's broken down system by system, and then before the short story it always like there's a map showing like the world in relation to its sun and if it has moons. It briefly explains the magic system, and then we'll go into the short story, right? So like it's just neat in concept about how it's supposed to be just like a collection of things that Chris has learned, right? The other interesting thing to remember about Taldain is like their main magic is like sand mastery, right? And so the sand on the planet, it's literally, the story is called White Sand. The sand on the planet that's used for their magic, for sand mastery, it reacts to investiture. And so we've actually seen this sand before. We see it in Rhythm of War whenever Navani and Raboniel were doing their test on trying to figure out, when they were doing their experiments and stuff. And so the interesting thing about this sand is that it glows when it detects investiture, and then it'll turn black after it's used in sand mastery. And the only way to recharge the sand, or reinvest the sand, is either by sun exposure from the original planet of Dayside, or it has to experience something else that's highly invested. And the only other thing that we know, like, so far in the Cosmere that's heavily invested are high storms. And so that's why we're able to see the sand on Roshar, and why it still works is because of the high storms. Because if you think about it, like, a high storm is able to recharge spears, and even the couple of examples of like of Kaladin, like, literally being recharged in the high storm. So it would only make sense that a high storm is able to, like, recharge the sand, right? And so I don't know. I think the only other time we've seen the sand is on Roshar. I don't think we've seen it anywhere else. But it's just interesting to note that it works on Roshar. Like, it's not bound to Taldain, how Aondor is bound to Elantris, or to Sel. So, guys, I hope that, I know I left stuff out, but I just, I wanted to just touch on, like, the main things, like, the big hitters for the new book. You know, let me know down below if there's any other things that you think are really important going into the Lost Metal. And, you know, I'll make sure to pin or highlight the main ones. But yeah, let me know if you guys are also excited for the Lost Metal. And if you are new to Brandon Sanderson, you know, I kind of just spoiled, like, a bunch of books for you. But I would say a good starting place is either Elantris or the first Mistborn series. I think they're both, the magic systems are, like, easy enough to grasp, and the stories are, like, really compelling. But yeah, I'm really excited for the Lost Metal. And like I said, I plan on doing, I'll give it a little bit so everybody can, like, get their hands on the book and read it and stuff. But probably, let's see, because if it comes out mid-November, maybe, like, first of the year, we'll sit down and do, like, a proper discussion of the Lost Metal. And, you know, maybe we'll get Daz in here, maybe have another special guest that likes Mistborn a lot, and we can go through and talk about it. And I think it'll be fun once we have this next book, seeing all the Cosmere implications that are in this book, because I mean, it's called the Lost Metal, so it's got to be big, right? So yeah, guys, thanks for hanging out today. We'll see you next time. Love you as always. See you later, guys.